I'd like to welcome Kym Iffert, who's the training program coordinator at Agape Animal Rescue. Welcome, Kym. Love to hear part 2 of your volunteer series today.
Okay, and I'm going to share everything because I've got a couple different things pulled up here. And again, I apologize for checking out. I had everything up and ready and my screen just went black. So thankfully I had another computer here and and I'm able to get that set up. So I'm just going to jump and get started because there's a lot in here. So on the front here, I've got a couple screens pulled up here because I'm going to switch over at some point, but just kind of starting like as someone who had worked as a volunteer coordinator for a while, just some of the things that were super helpful to me. And then towards the end, we're going to get more into behavior training and how we kind of worked on training volunteers for behavior. So, but I always find that it starts with training volunteers and setting appropriate expectations when they're first coming in. One of the first things that I found to be super helpful was being able to do a timely orientation. Something that I continue to run into in shelters in the Middle Tennessee area when I'm trying to get in and help out. I start out as a volunteer, and I find that when I sign up to volunteer, it's like, okay, we have this orientation on this Saturday at 11 o'clock, the last Saturday of every month. And we used to do that in my previous shelter as well. And we found that we missed out on a lot of volunteers because not everybody can make that Saturday or the last Saturday of, whatever month. So one of the first things that I did was went to an online orientation. If you're working in person, and if you're looking at my screen here, if you're working in person, it requires staff attendance and staff time. It also only allows for those volunteers who can make those specific days and times. Whereas if you go to an online orientation, it saves your staff time. You have to set it up once and you can do a presentation very similar to what I've got here, and then convert it to a PDF, and you can email that out to any of the volunteers that reach out that are looking for an orientation. So it allows a lot of variety in schedules. And the other thing that I found was super helpful was that it helped to weed out those people who just don't follow through. If they're not going to be following through on emails when they're first asking to become a volunteer, they're first interested in becoming a volunteer, they're probably not going to be checking and following up on emails as you continue to go through their volunteer process, or when you're looking for volunteers and you're trying to solicit people coming in at different times. You can use a basic format such as Google Slides, PowerPoint, Keynote, create basic, easy to follow presentations. These can be made at almost no cost other than just time spent. Most of us already have access to some of these. And then what I've always done with these as well is at the very end of the survey, I set up a volunteer in Google Forms because I use Google for a lot of this. But set up a very quick survey that they can link to at the end that just kind of asks them a few questions about, what are some of the, the most important things about volunteering, why is it important for you to, follow protocols or show up on time or whatever. And that way you can kind of see, did they read through it? Did they comprehend it? And it gives you the opportunity to figure out what challenges specific volunteers might have as you're going through it. So that is just kind of starting with the online volunteering. I keep pulling up all these different boxes here. So going on to once we have them through the orientation, and what I go through when it's with the orientation, I create an onboarding process. And onboarding, once they've gone through that, you've got the survey, you bring them in, it's super important to have an onboarding process so you can, number one, set very clear expectations, have transparency about your organization, and set up those volunteer guidelines, and talk a little bit about offboarding and why that might be important. The importance of setting those expectations. I think we all can kind of reinforce to each other that what people think volunteering in animal welfare is often very different than the reality. So setting those expectations can weed out some of those who really just don't have the physical or mental or even emotional capacity, and save your staff some valuable time in training, as well as dealing with disgruntled volunteers if it doesn't seem like what they thought it was going to be when they started out. Just a couple of examples here. You have somebody who comes in and they're going to clean and fold laundry. Well, do they understand that means they're going to go home with probably poop on their clothes? Playing with kittens also means sometimes scratches and Band-Aids and basic things like that. And not because they're mean kittens, but just because they're kittens. Playing with puppies, that's one of the biggest things. I just want to come in and I'll play with all the puppies. Who really has viable puppies? And do they have the understanding that, before we start interacting a lot with these puppies, we need to make sure that they are vaccinated and that we're watching out for disease, and they have to follow specific cleaning protocols just to play with those puppies. Walking dogs, if you have volunteers that are coming in to walk dogs, they need to understand that sometimes that might mean being dragged around or being dragged down, that sometimes you might have poop on your clothing. They might tear your clothing sometimes. You can be knocked down by jumpy dogs. You might have to become sort of a novice dog trainer. And you have to follow the rules and the practices and the protocols to keep the people and the animals safe. So setting that expectation before they even start and letting them understand it's not all just fun because they love dogs or they love cats is going to be really important in your very early stages of engaging a volunteer. The importance of transparency, and transparency means a number of different things. What are your shelter practices? What are your social media guidelines? What is your offboarding practice? And we'll talk about each of these. Shelter practices. Who do they contact? Is there a human resource person when they have issues with other volunteers, if they have some issues with staff interactions, if they, when you're dealing with the animals, what are those animal practices? What kind of appropriate handling? There are plenty of shelters who, I know we're talking about behavior teams here. So hopefully we're not in this, but there are plenty of shelters who are still using very aversive and corrective methods when they're doing training with their animals. So understanding or letting your volunteers know that there are certain practices that we follow. If there are incidents, and how to report those things. If your shelter does perform euthanasia for behavioral reasons, making sure that they understand that you have practices in place for what are those decision factors, and making sure that all of those things are going back to those incident reports. All of those incidents might be documented so that if there is somebody whose heart is breaking over a particular animal, you can walk through and let them, help them understand the reasons why some of these decisions might have been made. Again, very important to be transparent upfront about, what those practices are. And then just basic practices, are there staff only areas, and why might that be important for them to understand? Are there specific times that you want them to have them come in for volunteering? Do you have logs that you have them, or do you log those times, or do you have behavior logs that they're going to need to fill out? So making sure that they understand what they're getting into from the very beginning of all of this. I see a comment pop up, but I'm going to get sidetracked if I look at it. So transparency in each of these is really important. Transparency in social media. Create clear policies as you're bringing volunteers in, because I know we have in our animal care and control very specific volunteer groups for communicating information. And then we have a Facebook group. There are Google chat groups that we invite people to so that we can have those communications internally versus externally on Facebook pages or other social media outlets that might be open to the public. Guidelines about sharing content. Does it have to go through someone specific? What content should or should not be shared? What kind of videos do we want going out there? Because sometimes people think certain things are really cute, but it might not make the animals look as though they're in their best light when they're shared. And somebody who is just a volunteer, I shouldn't say just a volunteer, somebody who is acting as a volunteer might not understand the difference between cute and potentially dangerous, or cute and could be off-putting to people who might be looking at adopting. Who do they contact with certain questions? And if social media guidelines are not followed, or guidelines in general are not followed, are there consequences? What might that look like? And who talks to the volunteer about that? A process for offboarding. And this is something that I have found to be really important. And again, it's kind of a transparency thing. An offboarding is if you have to dismiss a volunteer, or if a volunteer decides to leave, you can get information about how your shelter is doing. Why is that person leaving if it's of their own accord? And nothing starts a gossip chain faster than a disgruntled volunteer. So outlining these processes before it might have to happen can prevent some of these issues, or even soften the impact for a volunteer who might feel that they're being dismissed if they are really unhappy, or if they feel like it was unwarranted. So some of the things that you need to consider, that we should be considering with offboarding: what specific interactions might result in offboarding? And that can be with animals, with staff, with other volunteers, over social media. how many incidents result? Like, is it something that, that's happened once and we cannot tolerate that? Do we have a zero tolerance? Or do we say, you know what, this is kind of a case by case basis, but these are things that we need to think about up front. We always kind of had a sort of 3 strikes, you're out. But again, it depends on what the strikes are sometimes. Clarify why certain things might result in a volunteers being dismissed. Is it first and foremost, I always think safety of the staff, volunteers, or other animals. If somebody is compromising safety, that's something that should not be tolerated. If it's animal learning, if they're doing something that is going to cause an animal to have negative interactions moving forward, that's something that maybe it's a re-education when we come into that. And sort of third, last but certainly not least, is the well-being of the organization and its mission. If somebody is going out and doing things that look bad for us, or they're out in public with an animal and they're treating them in a way that is not appropriate, or if they're out in public talking about our shelter or our organization in a different way that just is not reflecting well on us and isn't the whole process, that's something that we need to make clear to our volunteers. Keeping documentation of any incidents or altercations that might be happening, excuse me, reminding volunteers of what those practices, social media practices, are at the time of offboarding, so that that's a reminder, now that you may not be part of our volunteer, part of our organization, these things are still in place as far as you're concerned. Keeping track of other staff and volunteers who might be impacted by the dismissal of a volunteer. If it's somebody who's a good friend, or a confidant, or somebody who is kind of on the side of that volunteer, might not understand why something is happening. It's important to make sure that we are keeping track of that and keeping that transparent factor open, so that we can have those conversations. Excuse me, maintaining transparency around those reasons for dismissal or offboarding. And again, always confidentiality around personal concerns. We're going to jump right to the next one. And then volunteer guidelines, the importance of transparency and just having guidelines set. First and most important, I think, is who to contact and when. Again, when we start about talking about the gossip chain, which I think can be very frustrating with volunteers in general, making sure that we are eliminating any confusion. If it's a volunteer who is out in the public, that's one thing. If it's a volunteer who's working within the shelter or with specific animals, if we start talking about behavior volunteers, making sure that they know exactly who to go to. Do they go to the animal staff? Do they go to a volunteer coordinator? Do they go to a human resources, a shelter manager? Making sure that those are defined before a volunteer starts working with different things. How are decisions made about volunteers who are making a change in status? So if you have a volunteer, like we always kind of had levels for working with different animals based on the animal's presence in the shelter and out of the shelter. So are those decisions made because a volunteer has been there for a certain period of time? Are there assessments that you are performing with the volunteers? Is it by invitation that you see a volunteer who's doing really great and they're there and they're consistent and they follow all the rules? Does a staff member kind of invite that volunteer? But having some guidelines around that, so you don't have volunteers who just decide, oh, I should be able to work with those harder dogs, I'm really good at it. There might be some training that comes with that. So making sure that they understand, again, how is that decision made about a volunteer who might be moving through different processes, and what training is required for those different situations. When and how do those training updates occur, and what guidelines or what happens when a volunteer doesn't follow those guidelines? If somebody, like I said, just decides, I've been really good, and I know that dog is a giraffe dog, and we'll talk about giraffe dogs in a bit. If that dog is a giraffe dog, I can work with giraffe dogs, I'm really good. But if they haven't been trained on what that giraffe dog needs, what do we do with that volunteer? There's certainly someone who wants to do the right thing and wants to get more involved, so we don't necessarily want to dismiss them, but we need to make sure that we have talking points. So making sure that that a staff member, not asking other volunteers to address volunteers, but making sure that a staff member addresses these things as quickly and as kindly as possible. Everybody that's walking in your shelter is trying to do good things. That we're documenting all incidents and the discussions, and that we have the volunteers sign off on that documentation, and making sure that we have a clear policy in place for all of these things before it's ever needed. considerations for volunteer training. So all volunteers, in my opinion, all volunteers should have basic body language training. Even if there's someone who's just doing the laundry, there's always a chance that an animal gets out, an animal gets loose, and they need to know what to expect and how to deal with it. And talking points about your organization. Your volunteers are your face out in public. So if somebody comes in and says, if somebody, their neighbor is asking, oh, you work for that animal shelter, I heard they're a kill shelter. And the volunteer goes, no, 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 we never euthanize animals. Make sure they understand what those practices are and that they can say truthfully, you know what, we only euthanize for specific reasons, or you're right, we don't euthanize animals, or make sure that they have good talking points. And then volunteer training can be varied based on what the volunteers are doing. So we had kind of task-based volunteers, so someone who might be elderly or a little more frail, or is recovering from an injury, something else, or they just need a break from working with the animals. We put them on different tasks, and that might be laundry, that might be food prep, that might be preparing enrichment for the animals, it might be cleaning and organizing or out in community events, but giving them some alternatives so that it's not just walking dogs or socializing cats. And then making sure that we have our animal care volunteers and specific training protocols for those. When I'm looking at animal care volunteers, I want to make sure that they have training on leash handling, appropriate leash handling, how to get in and out of the kennel doors, carry and transfer techniques. If we're moving a dog from a kennel to an outdoor yard, what things do they need to be aware of in advance? If there's another dog walking down the hall, if there are people walking down the hall, if there if we have barrier reactivity concerns, making sure that they understand basic techniques for moving the animals through the shelter safely. If we're moving a cat from one room to the next, making sure that we know how our volunteers know how to move those animals safely from one area to another. What are our specific routines when coming in? Where do they find their supplies? How do they fill out an incident report? And what means they need to fill out an incident report? What is an incident in your shelter? Appropriate areas to work in. Where can they bring the animals? Knowing which animals to work with. And then again, going back to that requirements for change in status. Sometimes we would have trained volunteers who had been there for a certain number of time and it had become higher status, working with behavior things. They would become our sort of lead volunteers to help save staff time in training some of the new volunteers. And then training updates for those change in status. So I've got my little asterisk down here. Consider categorizing your animals based on the volunteer's experience. We used to have green, yellow, and red dogs. Green dogs were the ones that pretty much anybody could work with, the cute little fluffies that hardly ever come into your shelter. And when they do, they get adopted very quickly. So you don't have a lot of time to get those brand new volunteers in to work with them. But we found that green, yellow, red, people were like, green are the good dogs, yellow are the ones that I'm not sure about those, and red were the scary dogs. So we changed it to a number system, but the volunteers very quickly figured out, I only want to walk the number 1 dogs. I don't want to walk the number 5 dogs. And what we found worked for us was we called them different animals. So we had giraffes and monkeys, and gosh, I forget what the other one was. But we would kind of figure out that by naming them something completely different, it didn't give an expectation beforehand. So our giraffes were kind of the ones that needed a little more, they became our behavior cases. So you had to go through monkey training, tiger training, it was tigers, monkeys, tigers, and giraffes, or monkeys and tigers before you could be a giraffe trainer. And then we also had our star dog walkers, and those were our lead trainers. And star was special training and reinforcement because they were also able to train volunteers. So categorizing your animals so that people know which ones they are. Like if you are a monkey trainer, you can only train sort of the easier dogs. If you are a tiger trainer, you've already done the easy dogs, you've been there for a period of time, you can move on to the next ones. And then once you've done that, it was kind of by invitation. We would choose, and kind of getting to our lead volunteers, we would sort of choose our volunteers based on who had been there, who did we see a lot of success with, who really truly followed the protocols, who would let us know that they had a question or concern, because a lot of times they don't want to come to you and say they have a concern because they think that puts an animal at risk. Making sure that those volunteers understand bringing up concerns really gives us the opportunity to work on that, and not that it's just going to, red flag an animal. So again, so our lead volunteers, we considered, or we started using them to help train some of the newer volunteers. Again, it saved staff time and it created more opportunities for engagement, and gave our volunteers sort of a community to work within. And for all of our volunteers and for our lead volunteer or our lead staff member who would train behavior volunteers, we always had a 3-step program. So the first thing was that we would have the staff or a lead member volunteer for our newer ones coming in. They would do everything with the person following along. So the staff or the lead was the first one to do all the training. The second part of that training process was that the staff and the new volunteer in that area would work together. So we'd have one session where it was just the person, the volunteer following, but the lead person doing everything. The second time was the staff and the volunteer would work together, gave opportunity to talk through it, but the volunteer was asking questions while we were actually doing it. And the third time we did it, the volunteer, and maybe we'd have to do that second step 3, 4, 5 times. But finally, when they were comfortable with everything, they would actually lead. And then the staff or the volunteer would lead, and the staff member would follow and just make sure they had all the talking points and that they were able to actually follow, get their timing down and all that good stuff. So for behavior training, and I'm almost done here. For behavior training, we had our volunteers who clearly understand the importance of the routine, agency of the animals, following the protocols, and having the heart and the capacity, physical and emotional capacity for that more challenging work. Communication around why there were, certain animals were categorized for them to work with, a clear step-by-step process for every protocol. And that is my one right here. So we would have this, and I have different behavior logs, but a step-by-step protocol. We had 3 different methods for working on barrier activity. Each method had 2 to 3 steps that you follow. When they were done, they would go in here and they would put the date that they worked, the method that they used, which step did they get to, because you might not get through all 4 steps in a day. And then what was the animal's response and their observations about how it worked. So back to step-by-step process, consider those behavior checklists for each animal. I also have this in a Google form, so it's easier for them to fill out on a computer if you have access to that. Utilizing a system of observation-based language and training them on observation-based language was important. And clear communication with whom they need to report any incidents, concerns, or context information that might have affected the training that day. And then again, going back to considering that 3-step demonstration plan. And then with our ongoing volunteers, behavior training, and I know we're getting super close to time here. Behavior training, utilizing volunteers for behavior cases. I always wanted to make sure that they had an in-depth and ongoing understanding of and training of defensive handling. I've got a link down here to a free on-demand webinar from Michael Shikasio about defensive handling courses that I had all of my behavior trainers or volunteers go through that before they could ever start. Making sure that they understand what emergency practices might be in place and what protocols were important, as well as having strictly defined training protocols. And again, going back to, you have a specific one for barrier reactivity, a specific one for leash pulling, another one for jumpy behaviors, another one for maybe mouthy leash biting behaviors. So we had very specific ones for every protocol that we were going to work on. For those step-by-step instructions. And then I have a more detailed one that they go through in training that has managing the behavior, how to manage the environment. And then this one that I just showed you is just how to train. And then we also keep these checklists, again, this little checklist here or the behavior log, so that we can track that behavior and see, are we progressing? Are we regressing? Is it a specific volunteer that is progressing or regressing with that animal? And how might we need to, or when might we need to re-educate? And that's what our daily behavior logs were for, our daily training responses, which is part of that, and any updates in the change or the protocol that we might be working with that animal. And then last but not least, making sure that we are being transparent and understanding that we need to identify compassion fatigue in our volunteers as well. Burnout is real, and it leads to those disgruntled and lost volunteers. So signs of potential compassion fatigue that I would see: volunteers who start coming every single day and they spend the entire day there. They're giving up their lives because they feel like if they don't come in, nobody else will. Volunteers who start missing shifts that were generally really good about showing up and being responsible and showing up on time. Volunteers who suddenly start having a special interest in an animal. Volunteers who aren't reporting incidents or new behaviors. Volunteers who might start overstepping boundaries and reaching out to other volunteers without having talked to the behavior staff, or discussing animal behaviors with volunteers instead of staff. Those are kind of red flags that somebody might be escalating into compassion fatigue or burnout. And ways to prevent those: just being open, being transparent, talking about compassion fatigue with your volunteers and letting them understand that this is a real thing in animal welfare or any, human welfare even. If hard decisions are having to be made, we want to alert our volunteers beforehand so that we can prepare them that something, some action might be taken. Maintaining those open discussions about the whys and the hows and the documentation behind these. And encourage cross-training in volunteers so that if they do need to take a break from working with your animals, they can go into some of those task-based things and you can keep them engaged and keep them there and keep track of how they're doing. And that is the very quick version of basic volunteer training. I can share all of these. When I share this presentation, there are links to, again, the Michael Shikasio examples of the written protocols, and I'll link to the behavior logs that we have here as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kym. This is super, super interesting.